Good morning. When I was a wee little Jersey, before I had the beard on my face and when I still had hair on my head, I did not like going to the doctor. The doctor was not fun, especially if shots were on the menu. I'm sure everyone can understand this. So how did my mom deal with taking me to the doctor? If I didn't make a fuss, which I progressively got better at, I could get a reward. Preferably, my desired reward was a slushie from Quick Check, but the slushie machine was very inconsistent, so I would easily settle for one from 7-Eleven, which was conveniently located by the doctor's office. Rewards are a great motivator for children, but as we've all learned, they're a good motivation for all of us. We all realize we can get someone to do something for us if we appeal to something they want, sometimes to their self-interest. Virtually all advertising is based on this premise. Why should you buy my product and go to my store? Because it will save you money, because it'll make something easier for you. The same can be said for politics. Why should you vote for me? Because I'll do this or that for you. So, it might seem strange to us at first when Jesus offers us a reward for fasting. Shouldn't the reward simply be God himself? Is Jesus simply appealing to our own self-interest, to our own desires to please ourselves? Or is something else going on here? Today in our sermon on fasting, we will see how this reward relates to fasting and how fasting can reward us. We will see that fasting is a deeply spiritual activity that can change you if you let it. Simeon, the new theologian, a monk who lived around 1000, was not far off the mark when he said that fasting is the beginning and foundation of every spiritual activity. Simeon understood that fasting is a manifestation of a deep part of the Christian life, self-denial. Fasting is a physical denial of our physical desires that forces us to confront our inner desires as well. By the end of this sermon, I hope we can come to better understand what Simeon meant when he said this. As we work through our passage this morning, we will look specifically at three different things. First, the hypocrisy of the Pharisees. What is hypocrisy and how do we avoid it in fasting? 2, fasting in secret. What does it mean to fast in secret, and what should we do when this secrecy is threatened? Third and finally, the reward. What is this reward? How should we desire this reward? And how does fasting change the way we relate to such a reward? Let's read the passage again in Matthew 6:16-18. When you fast, do not look sad like the hypocrites, for they make it clear on their faces that they are fasting. Truly I say to you, they have their reward. But when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, so that you may not be seen fasting by men, but by your Father in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. First, we notice that Jesus says, when you fast, not if. Evidently, Jesus assumed that people following him were either already fasting or he wanted them to start doing so. Many of us, especially as evangelical Protestants, may never have fasted before, or we may even view it with some kind of suspicion. I find this extremely strange because fasting has been part of the Christian tradition virtually since the inception. Fasting was not simply something Christians did to show piety. It was seen as essential to theological work. Early Christians believed certain theological insights were not possible without the hard work of prayer, fasting, giving to the poor, among other things. How did we lose this assumption of fasting? I will venture to give an oversimplified answer. The problem is our lack of connection with Christian history and tradition. By tradition, I do not mean traditionalism, that is, the dead faith of the living, but rather tradition, that is, the living faith of the dead. If the church consists of all believers throughout time, both those who are on heaven and both who are on earth and in heaven, who are living and dead, then the faith of the dead is in fact still living. Their words can still speak to us today, but often we do not listen. We are so obsessed with the new, we fail to pay attention to the old. Also, as Protestants, we have suspicion of anything that seems remotely Catholic. Well, when Catholicism reigned supreme for over 1,000 years, most Christians in history were Catholic. Thus, we end up restricting ourselves to things current or those within our own narrow denomination. If we put our prejudice aside for a brief moment and listen attentively, the tradition always surprises us. If so many Christians throughout history have thought that fasting was essential, we should listen to them. And since these ancient Christians have far more experience in fasting than any of us, I will make use of their wisdom today throughout this sermon. Next, Jesus says, "Do not look sad like the hypocrites, for they make it clear on their faces that they are fasting." These past few weeks, we've already talked a lot about hypocrisy. So much so, I finally learned how to spell it. Almost. What makes someone a hypocrite? The main hallmark of a hypocrite is inconsistency. Jesus rails against inconsistency again and again, especially later in the Gospel of Matthew. He points out as inconsistent in swearing by the gold on the sanctuary over the sanctuary itself, because both are sanctified by God. He complains the Pharisees bend over backwards for the smallest detail of the law, but neglect right judgment, mercy, and faithfulness. Jesus mocks the inconsistency of keeping things ritually clean on the outside, while inwardly you are an unclean and ugly person. With the psalmist, Jesus says, "I have seen the treacherous, and I am disgusted, because they do not keep your word." What marks the hypocrisy of the Pharisees specifically regarding fasting? That they were fasting to be seen by men and not God. The Pharisees and religious leaders were making a display of their fasting. It was something done to be seen. They made it obvious that they were fasting on their faces. It could not be missed. They used fasting as a pretense. At first glance, surely these looked like spiritual and deeply religious people. But it is God who looks at the heart, and that is where the inconsistency lies. Outward, it all looks good, but inwardly, they are doing it for all the wrong motivations, the wrong reasons, the wrong desires. They are fasting to be approved by others, not God, and that was all they received. If a hypocrite is inconsistent, then we must be consistent. What are the requirements of consistency? Understanding and discipline. Understanding is important because you have to understand how something works, its underlying rationale, to actually do it. Think about in the office how Michael did diversity day or sensitivity training. He didn't understand these things, and thus he couldn't actually do what they were supposed to do, how they were supposed to be done. In order for us to really do and commit to something wholeheartedly, we have to understand its inner rationale. The same can be said for fasting. If we do not grasp the spirit of fasting, we will not be able to keep the practice of fasting. Long ago, Isaiah charged Israel with failure to truly understand the core of fasting. Israel kept the observances exactly, but failed to grasp the spirit. As Isaiah says in chapter 58, "Is this the fast I choose like this, a day for man merely to humble himself, only to bend his head like a reed, and just to spread out sackcloth and ashes like a bed? Will you call this a fast and a day of favor to the Lord? Shouldn't the fast I choose be like this, to loosen the wicked chains, to break the straps of the yoke, and to set the captives free, and to break every yoke? Isn't it to break your bread with the hungry, and the homeless poor to bring into your house? When you see the naked, cover him, and do not hide yourself from your own flesh. Then your light will break forth like the dawn, and your healing will quickly sprout." Simply put, fasting is not really about the physical act of fasting. Basil of Caesarea, an important 4th century theologian, sums up the idea here. True fasting is being a stranger from vice. If you keep whatever religious observances are generally good, but continue in sin in other areas of your life, when you do what you want and fight and oppress and are angry, what good are those religious observances? You have to understand what God really wants from you. I desire steadfast love and not sacrifice, knowledge of God more than burnt offerings. And if you offer a sacrifice of any kind, but your brother has something against you, stop and go and be reconciled with your brother. That shows you've understood what sacrifice is really about. Fasting becomes truly powerful not when you understand the various ins and outs of the observances, but when you realize how it helps you in the big things that God cares about. Take, for example, this short anecdote from church history. There were 2 men who met to eat a meal. One of them provided some meat. The other says that he has not eaten meat since he began his religious life. The other hears about this and says that since he has begun his religious life, he has not let anyone leave him angry. One fasted from food, but the other from anger. One of these men focused on the outward observances, not eating meat. The other focused on the inward, not being angry. That is what fasting is about. Now, at this point, you might ask me, if fasting is really about the things God cares about and less about the physical observances, why do I need to fast? I don't need to fast in order to be a stranger from vice. Let me answer that question with another one. Why do we come together each week and physically eat the cup and bread? And you can't say it's because Jesus told us to. God doesn't do things randomly. We physically eat and drink in remembrance because it's important for us to physically do something to help us remember. And as similar with fasting, the physical act helps us do the spiritual act. Second, to be consistent, we need to be disciplined. Once you have grasped the spirit of something, then you have to act it out. You have to be disciplined in order to consistently apply this understanding. Think about the illustration Paul makes in 1 Corinthians 9, where he says, an athlete must be disciplined in all things in order to win the race. Any athlete knows that they can't be lazy off the court and after practice, but still succeed in the game. Discipline takes over all aspects of the athlete's life. It is the same for us. Of course, discipline can be tiresome and sometimes tedious. But if we fail to be disciplined in applying what we have come to understand and grasp, we will become inconsistent and thus hypocrites. As I've realized this more and more, I now understand that the most important spiritual battles I face are not big ones, it's the small ones. And that is where the real war is waged. Small things like remaining calm when someone bothers me at work, when the car is too slow in front of me, not letting my dirty dishes stack up, making sure I do my basic Bible reading. These are the things I need to focus on. If I cannot be disciplined in the small things, why do I think I can tackle the big ones? If you think God will give you 5 and 10 talents, why do you think God will give you 5 or 10 talents when you can only handle the one? What are ways in which fasting becomes inconsistent? We can become inconsistent when we fast and to what extent. We cannot let our whims dictate fasting. It is inconsistent to do one thing one week and another the next simply because we don't feel like it. Of course, there are some exceptions like for illness. But once we make a commitment, we must stick with it. Often, especially when I started fasting, there were some weeks I just did not want to do it. I dreaded looking forward to it. However, as time went on and I stuck with it and did it again and again, there began to be a few weeks where I'd actually look forward to fasting. as if I felt like I needed it in some sense to rebalance myself. Truly spiritual actions are those when we struggle most with ourselves to remain committed precisely at the time we want to stop. We can also be inconsistent by doing too much right away. If we overextend our physical ability, especially in fasting, we do more damage to ourselves in the long run. It would be like if you wanted to run a 10K and on the first day of training, you tried to run the entire 10K. When you start small and build your way up. Start with something simple. You can fast for just one meal a day. You can stop eating snacks and only eat at meal times. You could try to eat meat just once a day. If you take multiple servings, just take one. Then you can build from there. The goal should be get to a point where you can fast for 24 hours from one meal to the next, so from dinner one night to dinner the next. Consensus is that fasting is good, but you should always eat something at least once a day to avoid making fasting burdensome. One final inconsistency is indulging right before or after. It is inconsistent to try to eat more before or after a fast to make up for it. I always find it tempting to do these small things to try to negate my fast. Like, if I eat later in the day before, I might not be as hungry in the morning, or I'll eat more so that I won't be as hungry the next day, or I'll have an extra snack on the day after. It is these things that undercut the fast. After I fast, if I get myself a little extra something, what reward will be left for God to give me? In a sense, we are always fasting. We are always avoiding indulgence. Hypocrisy at its root is inconsistency, and to be consistent, we must grasp the thing's true meaning, and we must be disciplined in order to do it, to convert our understanding into consistent action. Next, Jesus' solution to the Pharisees' hypocritical fasting before men is to fast in secret. If you are tempted to do something like fasting for the praise of men, then make sure people can't tell. If you fast in secret and pray in secret, then you're more likely to fast simply for God himself and not for others. Jesus says, anoint your head and wash your face. When you fast, make sure you look the same as any other day. No one should be able to tell. Even act in the same way. Don't complain about being hungry or tired or this or that. In fact, when you fast, make it that day to do extra things, to stop putting off that errand, that chore, that call. No one should be able to tell you are fasting from your outward appearances and actions. But this raises the question, how secret do we need to be? Most of us go out and about each day, or are you supposed to go hide away in the corner so that no one will be able to tell? And wouldn't that be more suspicious? What about when we eat with our family and friends? What if someone invites us somewhere? What if I need to host somebody suddenly? These are all excellent questions. First, what should you do if someone offers you food or even just a snack when you are fasting? If you turn it down, it could look ungrateful or strange. If you say you are fasting, well, now you've broken the rule of fasting in secret. Here's a story about how some Christians dealt with this problem. There was once a hermit who was fasting, and he went to visit another fellow hermit. And as they were visiting, some pilgrims came, and the hermit he was visiting decided to make everybody some soup. When they sat down to eat, the fasting hermit took one single pea from the soup and ate it. The brothers noticed this and reprimanded him and said, if you visit someone, don't make a display there of your way of life. Even though this man tried to keep his fast and eat with everybody else, he kind of had the worst of both worlds. It was so important for these people not to make any display of their life that they considered it better to break their fast if someone offered them food than to refuse the food in order to keep their fast. So, if you're fasting and someone offers you food or a meal or whatever, simply receive it without protest and with thanksgiving. If someone makes plans with you on the day you fast, simply accept and make it up later. As we see throughout this sermon, fasting is important, but some things are more important. Most of us live with somebody, our family, our friends, or our roommate. How do we keep things secret from them? Remember that the real problem is being seen by others, making that the purpose of your fasting. It is not Jesus is not wholesale saying that a fast is void once anybody has any idea about it. You could fast at the same time that you live with. For those of you with kids, your fast can be an example to them. But if you fast differently alone than with others, you may be fasting for them and not God. What about the opposite problem? Instead of being offered food, what if you feel the need to show someone else food as well? What should you do then? Remember that the fast was made for man and not man for the fast. Is it right to break your fast in order to do good? Of course. Christians have always taken the command to show hospitality very seriously because it's an important biblical theme. Abraham showed hospitality to 3 strangers by the oaks of Mamre. Elijah subdued the Aramean army by having the king show them hospitality and throwing them a feast. And of course, Jesus showed hospitality to the crowds by multiplying the 5 loaves and 2 fish. The patriarchs, prophets, and the Lord himself all showed hospitality, even to the poor and their enemies. If you find yourself in a situation where you may need to break or delay a fast to show hospitality and kindness, you must do so. As one monk points out, a fast has its own reward, but whoever eats because of love obeys 2 commandments. He loses his self-will and refreshes his brother. Notice that there are 2 different commandments or rewards he mentions. One is an inward one and the other outward. The inward relates to losing self-will. Self-will is simply our own wicked will that we choose to follow instead of God's will. Remember at the beginning how I said that Simeon said that fasting is a part of self-denial. When we break a fast to show love for others, we are still practicing self-denial because we are putting the needs of others before our own. When we show hospitality when fasting, we put aside our own will for something good in order to do something better. We cannot value our own spiritual acts over the needs of others. The outward reward is refreshing our brothers and sisters. As some of you know, I have been learning how to cook, much to my mother's delight. I have found that it makes me happy to see people enjoy my food. To see someone refreshed by my food is indeed a great reward. But refreshing others and showing hospitality is not only a matter of a good meal. Many Christians in ancient times were poor, and showing hospitality was a way of helping those in need, even at your own expense. Remember what Isaiah said, that the true fast is to share your bread with the poor. Don't be afraid of showing hospitality to those in need, even at your own expense. Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. Fast in secret, emphasis on secret. It is more important to remain in secret than even to fast. If someone offers you food when you are fasting, you are still fasting in secret by receiving it. And you are still fasting in secret when you provide hospitality to your neighbor, even if you eat with them. Eating in love is more important than abstaining from food. So far we have discussed already first the hypocrisy of the Pharisees and how not to be hypocritical in fasting, and we just discussed what it means to fast in secret. Now we must move on to our third and final section, the reward. That our Father who sees in secret will reward us. As I've already said, fasting is for God and not for the praise of others. So if it is for God, why a reward? Shouldn't God himself be our reward? To fully address this, we need to take a step back, or perhaps 2 or 3. Why do rewards work? Because they appeal to something we desire. Why is it important to appeal to our desires? Because once we desire something, we act in order to obtain it. Our desire is prior to our will. So if we are to properly address this topic of the reward, we must address desire. Whether you've been a Christian for a long time or are just interested in God now, we all have desires and desire certain things. What is desire? Where does it come from, and where is it going? And how does God relate to desire? First, we must relate desire and God. They are closely related. In fact, I might say they're the same. As John says, God is love. If God is love, then God must also be desire. Can you love without desire? Isn't desire what prompts us to love in the first place? Desire is what drives us to love. Desire existed in God because God is both the subject and object of love, specifically as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. The Father loves the Son loves the Father, and the Spirit loves the Father and the Son. Desire existed because desire existed before creation in God, who is Trinity. We are created in God's image. That means we reflect something about God. We love because He first loved us, or perhaps I should re-put it, we love because He is love. How can we love? Why do we desire? Because God, who is love, created us in His image. We reflect the love and desire that God deposits in us as His image bearers. When we desire, it is not necessarily our desire, but God's desire in us. We do not have to create our own desire afresh for God. It is already in us. We just need to find it. Imagine your desire, or God's desire in you, like a web. What simply began as desire for God has become entangled with so many things. This web of desire makes us who we are. We always think of our desire as something close to us, but we fail to realize how close. Love and desire do not merely inform us, among other things. They are who we are. This creates a big problem, because parts of the web have absolutely nothing to do with God. How do we sort through all of these desires to find the true one? We must begin a long evaluation of our loves and desires. Only God is to be loved as an end in and of Himself. All other loves must be rightly ordered according to this one. Some things we must love more because they help us love God alone. Other things we must love less because they do not help us love God alone. When we fast, we resist one of the most fundamental desires we have, hunger. When we fast, we temporarily put aside the desire for food, not only to learn how to desire God, but to learn how to desire everything else in the proper way and order. And when I say everything, I mean everything. As you move this web of desires, you realize that these are connected in strange, deep, and subtle ways. If you pull on this one, that one moves. Tug on this one, that one tightens. This is why discipline is important, because all of our desires are connected. We like to think of all of our desires as separate and compartmentalize them. This is my desire for food. This is my desire for sex. This is my desire for validation, for rest, for money, and so on and so forth. But they are all one. Deviations gone astray from the root of God's desire. A lack of discipline in one desire can easily and quickly spread to the others. As we put old desires aside and order the others correctly, our desire for God grows. As our desire changes, so does the reward we seek from God. We seek many things from God, often good things. But there's always the issue of seeking the gifts instead of the giver. Fasting is a continual crucible for ourselves. We return again and again to interrogate our desires and the rewards we seek. In fasting, we purify our desires and order them in relation to the one who gives us all things and from whom all our desire originates, including for the food we eat every meal. Fasting does not only promise a reward, fasting changes the reward we seek. Fasting is our teacher. We are its apprentice. It is not bad for us to desire rewards and good things from God. In fact, God uses good and beautiful things to awaken our soul and to get our attention. It only becomes a problem when we never move beyond the rewards here below. As we progress deeper and deeper, God's desire grows in us more and more and overpowers all other desires. Then we cease to seek any rewards. All we desire is the giver and not the gifts. And even when God does give us gifts and rewards, we cherish them not as gifts in and of themselves, but as things that come from Him. Just as the lover cherishes a gift from their beloved, they cherish it not because of what it is, but because it comes from their beloved. We continue to seek more and more of God. We long for His presence, to be before Him. When can I go and be before God? Cries out the psalmist. Now, this all seems very nice and good, but it also seems very difficult and far away. Why is it so hard to desire rightly? There is a danger that emerges to threaten the gift of the giver himself. What, or better, who is this danger? Ourself. Why is it so hard to desire rightly, to desire God? We get in our own way. If it is correct that all our desires make up and determine who we are, ourself, then any change in our desire means a change in who we are, in ourself. As we begin to desire anyone or anything, but especially God, desire becomes a destabilizing experience to ourselves, to the very concept of who we think we are. Anne Carson says that love does not happen without a loss of vital self. Desire threatens to completely upend who we are. Perhaps this is one of the reasons for the repeated admonition in the Song of Songs: do not arouse or awaken desire until it wants. Desire is our personal Pandora's box. Once it is open, you cannot remain the same. As we progress into God's desire, we are continually faced with a choice. Will we let God's desire dictate all our other ones, or will we let our desires flow in any direction? We are too attached to ourselves as we currently are. Fasting helps keep this danger at bay. Through fasting, we routinely force ourselves to deny our basic desires. What desires will rule us? What desires will dictate what we will be and who we will be? Fasting not only changes the reward we seek, it changes us. Just as we deny food for ourselves when we fast, we deny ourselves. If anyone desires to follow me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever desires to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. Once this process of continually purifying our desires and fasting begins, we cannot turn back, or else it will all be for nothing. For no one who puts their hand to the plow and looks back is fit for the kingdom of God. How is fasting the beginning and foundation of every spiritual activity? Fasting is a physical denial of our physical desires that forces us to confront our inner desires as well, so that we may become more spiritual and virtuous followers of Christ. There are so many things we want. Fasting forces us to stop doing what we want, to stop eating what we want, to stop eating when we want, sometimes even to stop fasting so that we can keep ourselves in check. I encourage you today to pick something to try this week. Remember, start small, just one meal, or only eating at meal times. If you have a medical condition where you cannot fast, that is fine. You can always abstain from something else that gets in the way of your desire. However, if you can go without food, I strongly urge you to do so. Yes, when you start fasting, it seems difficult. And yes, the reward takes a long time to reap. Stick with it, and I do not think you'll be disappointed. I have not been. Now, as we close, I know I've asked a lot of questions, but please give me one more. I said earlier that to fast, we must be constantly disciplined to fast consistently. If we are consistent, in a sense, we are always fasting, even when we are not in the strict sense. And we just discussed how fasting reshapes our desires back to their origin, to God. If fasting in some way affects all the meals that we eat, what about the meal of which we're about to partake of? How can we approach the Lord's Supper with an attitude of fasting? This is not to say that we shouldn't actually take the bread and the cup, but as we fast, we change how we relate to food in general. How does this change affect us when we come to eat the bread and drink the cup? Maybe we could say that in fasting, all of our desires become restricted. But it is in the Lord's Supper, in eating the bread and drinking the cup, that we are able to let our legitimate desires flow back to their ultimate source, back to God in worship. Fasting is an important spiritual activity for us as it forces us to confront our bad desires so that we may become more spiritual and virtuous people. But fasting also prepares us for true worship, for true eating, for the Lord's Supper. Let's close in prayer. Dear God, we thank you for the gift of fasting. We thank you for having given us fasting so that we may have something that reminds us to take off our old self and to be conformed to the image of your Son. We are always tempted to return to our old self. When we fast, may we rightly align all of our desires back to you. May our desire for things here below fade as desire for you becomes all-consuming. May we realize that all we receive, all that we eat, comes from you. It is you who sustains us. We may be able to go without food, but we cannot go without you, O God. Amen.